More than 70% of Africans depend on subsistence agriculture. More than 70% of Africans depend on subsistence agriculture to provide some food, employment, and of course a cultural existence. The vast majority of land in the African countryside through the colonial period and up to now has been governed according to local communities' customary land practices. It has been outside of private property, outside of the domain of capitalist penetration, most of it. This is now changing through the new scramble for Africa, through corporate and foreign government land grabbing. And I'll say something about land grabbing towards the end.
Pues la compra masiva de tierra. Las grandes
países quiso comprar, no sé, el 80% de las tierras cultivables de esta isla, Madagascar. Por poco y no compran todo Madagascar, nomás ya los tipos. El 80% venían a comprar.
How you see Latin Americans know much about Africa and love to speak.
The majority of African countries, of course, is highly dependent on the production and export of primary commodities, such as coffee, copper, fruit, diamonds, other minerals. Clothing and textile accounts for 70% of all manufactured exports from Africa. Changes in the global trade regime, rapid liberalization, changes in technology and increased competition from China has seen a process in which even this element of manufacturing industry is under threat, and we have now since the 1980s experienced in all of Africa, including South Africa, a period of deindustrialization. Except for a very brief period between 2002 and 2006 associated with the commodities boom. Although Africa accounts for 1 billion of the world's population, 15%, its share of world trade is just 1% and has been steadily declining. And the share of manufacturing goods is even less. Their low weight in international trade, their structural weaknesses and heavy dependence on foreign trade and finance makes them extremely vulnerable to external shocks, as we will see. The manufacturing sector is particularly vulnerable, not just because of its infancy, but because of its reliance on the primary sector for the provision of foreign exchange and sources of income. So if we take South Africa during the global crisis, just to illustrate this to you, in the 3 quarters of the recessionary period that affected South Africa, we had in the manufacturing sector a decline, a contraction of 22%, 23%, and 11%. That's how vulnerable even a more advanced so-called manufacturing industry in South Africa, it's even more, it demonstrates its vulnerability. That's the point I'm trying to make. Even a relatively strong economy like South Africa's. Of course, added to its dependence on the export of primary commodities is its dependence on the import of intermediary and capital goods necessary to industrialize and to provide low and unstable sources of income and foreign exchange necessary for investment and industrialization. The average income of Africa's least developed countries in 2006, and I think it's important to understand this to get the sense of the depth of the problem that we're dealing with, was $339 US. The average per capita income in Africa's LDCs. So that's less than 350, less than $1 a day. 22 African countries have per capita income of less than $266. When you exclude household consumption, so you take the household consumption out of that, 18 countries have a per capita income of just $50 available to finance government expenditure for public administration, social services, and investment, as well as to repay and service its foreign debts. In spite of most African countries being subsistence agricultural economies, they are net food importing countries. So Africa, as a region, is a net food importer. At the time of decolonization, or at the time of independence in the 60s, Africa was not just self-sufficient in food, but was actually a net food exporter. Its exports averaged 1.3 million tons a year between 1966 and 1970. But today the continent imports 25% of its food, with every country being a net food importer. And recently, South Africa joined this very auspicious club, thanks to the workings of free trade. More than 70% of Africans depend on subsistence agriculture, yet agriculture is one of the most neglected sectors in terms of aid and investment. About to change now. Climate change, of course, is making the conditions under which agriculture is practiced more and more uncertain. Drought and other extreme weather events are producing famine and forced migration. I think we could say that migration in Africa is another extremely important characteristic that we should engage with. As a result of the above, the revenue base of African countries is extremely weak, and most are dependent on foreign aid and budgetary support. The continuing debt crisis, which ensures that Africa remains a net exporter of capital, means that African countries face perennial current account deficits, which are mostly financed through foreign aid. And the significance of that, I think, is something we can come back to when we look at what's happened as a result of the global crisis. So it's in this context that we have to understand how the global crisis intersects with the situation and how this makes Africa extremely vulnerable to external shocks as the global crisis is experienced. So when we try to understand the nature of the global crisis, and we've already had some inputs around this, but just let me add a few salient points which I think we need to think about when taking into account how this impacts through Africa. Is that we're looking at a crisis which is historical, as Hannibal was saying, of an unprecedented proportion. But when we look at the economics of it, when we simply look at the level and the depth of the economic crisis, then we are looking at 1929, the Great Depression, as an analogy. And of course, this is something that is going to shape the problems and the difficulties Africa is going to experience for the next decade at least.